Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Galapagos Photography, capturing the wildlife of the Enchanted Isles, presented by Dr. Court Whelan. Court is NatHab's Director of Sustainability and Conservation Travel and has been guiding trips for us since 2013. It's a pleasure as always, Court. I'll hand it off to you.
Well, thank you, Kendall. Thanks everyone in the audience today. A warm welcome from Boulder. I know Punxsutawney Phil said we're having 6 more weeks of winter, but it is a very oddly summery day here in Boulder. It's like getting in the 60s. It's sunny out there, so yeah, you never know what those rodents and their weather forecasts. I think we're getting snow in a few days. But anyway, without further ado, we're getting into Galapagos Islands photography. It makes my heart pitter patter when I think about photographing in the Galapagos, because it's going to be a weird way of saying this. It's like the easiest way to get the best wildlife photographs on the planet. And we're going to talk about why that is, but it has a lot to do with just the proximity to the wildlife, their lack of natural fear of predators, including, humans as visitors in their land. They just stay there. In this photo, it just says so much. It's, you get the animal behaviors, big wildlife, you get diversity of wildlife, we get the juvenile gull there in the background. Extraordinary scenery from lava rock to beaches to mountains and even forests. There's a lot to love with photographing the Galapagos. It is the land, simply put, of big reptiles, really, really interesting birds, and incredible assemblages of wildlife, especially reptiles. It is the land of reptiles first and foremost, but it also has, of course, this incredible marine environment all around it. It's an archipelago. It's a chain of islands about 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador. And so everything is sort of connected to the marine ecosystem in one way or another, whether they get their food from the marine ecosystem because they're birds and they fish off the shores, or they actually live in the marine ecosystem for part of their time. So very, very fascinating place. And like I said, it's not just the beautiful scenery and the amazing wildlife, but it's the proximity and the density of wildlife and the behaviors and interaction with the wildlife. Different species will interact and be in one scene. This scene just kind of says it all. You get the Galapagos sea lion just kind of resting lazily, picking its head up, barking a little bit at the gulls right there, them barking back, and just this interesting cacophony, harmonious sort of environment. So we're going to talk about how to capture it, and we're going to go into some specific details, things like how to best photograph giant tortoises. But we're also going to talk about some more general things with general landscape that is pertaining to Galapagos and certain scenes and certain things. But even if you don't have a trip on the books to Galapagos planned, you're going to learn a lot about general nature and wildlife photography today, just from the examples I show. So as with a lot of times, we're going to step back and talk about the Galapagos quickly. At first, talk about a little bit of understanding of what's going on in the Galapagos archipelago, the ecosystem, et cetera, et cetera. In short, Galapagos Islands, like I mentioned, they're off the coast of Ecuador. They are a part of Ecuador, more or less. Ecuador owns them. They are 600 miles. You never really take a boat out there. Back in the day, you did. Charles Darwin, of course, did, but now you fly out there and you land in this area that's composed of about 13 major islands and 40 large rocks. That's basically the Galapagos. It is somewhat inhabited. You've got 4 islands with human habitation. It's not densely inhabited whatsoever. The towns are contained. There's a lot of environmental regulations, and it still remains very, very pristine to this day. And because of its nature being a relatively closed ecosystem, you can't really get there without flying on essentially a charter flight. It's very well protected. The people that live there are great stewards of the land. It is still a living laboratory, so it's a really, really great place to kind of step back in time and see what was going on, sort of as we watch evolution still take its course in an island chain that is really no more than 5 or 10 million years old, and wildlife on the islands probably far less than that. So I always like to talk about this. The geology of Galapagos is a really big cornerstone in understanding why it exists. So I very quickly just want to talk about it. So if we're looking at, Galapagos right around here, it is near a very heavily active area for tectonic plates. Remember, tectonic plates are the things that float essentially on top of the Earth's mantle. They're moving around all the time, very, very slowly in the human sense of time, but they're, for the last couple 100 million years, they've moved tremendously, going from Gondwana land to Pangaea, et cetera, et cetera. But so the reason I'm saying all this is that the Galapagos Islands is very near several major tectonic plate boundaries. That's a big deal for how islands are formed. They are formed from a traditional island chain geologic process, very similar to how the Hawaiian Islands came to be. Essentially what you have is, because of all those plate boundaries, you have a lot of magma underneath it that can find its way up to the surface at times. And what happens is, as these plates move, that magma channel, or that hot spot, doesn't move, but the land on top of it does move. So it's really interesting as you see this movement from west to east, which is exactly what's happening in the Galapagos. That hot spot that's spewing lava to the oceanic crust and eventually to the surface and creating islands, that hot spot doesn't move, it's always there, but the land does move across it, and you get these spurts of islands as that magma kind of increases and decreases its flow of liquid rock. So as a result, in the Galapagos, the reason I'm saying all this is you have this pronounced difference from the eastern part of the archipelago to the western part. The western part being the newest. We're talking about a volcano that's still active here, actually on Fernandina. We're talking about very rough, ropey lava, very little erosion. Some of this is literally years old. The island itself is probably, thousands to hundreds of thousands of years old. Contrast that with the eastern part of the archipelago, and that is the oldest islands. We're probably talking about most of this rock being heavily eroded, a lot of erosion from that water, the marine ecosystem lapping up and creating these tunnels and whatnot, beautiful tide pooling because of the erosion, about 5 to 10 million years old. So as a result, we get this really interesting landscape. There are forests in the Galapagos. There is a lot of vegetation, but most of it is this very interesting moon-like landscape where life has found a way. And I love this little yellow warbler, the same yellow warbler you're probably thinking of, has made its way to the island, just hopping amongst the tide pools in one of the islands. And this is just a great symbolism for how, in this rough landscape, life has found a way to thrive and flourish. So a real quick note on how the animals came to be. Well, basically 8 out of every 10 critters you're gonna see in the Galapagos is found nowhere else on Earth. Very high rate of what we call endemism, things that are found nowhere else on the planet. And that's why we love Galapagos. The long and the short of it, the way these animals became established in the Galapagos is largely through vegetation rafts. And this is a weird kind of wonky abstract concept, and you think, gosh, that seems pretty simple. That's really how scientists believe this is happening, and it is. For any sort of island colonization theory, it's vegetation rafts for those animals that do not fly. Now, of course, birds can fly out to the islands, or they can get blown off course from a wind or a hurricane, and that's how birds usually find themselves to these small little chains of islands. But the terrestrial critters, the reptiles, other animals like that, it's usually because of a small little raft of vegetation like this. And this is not a great photo, but I wanted to show you very briefly what happens here. So there are a lot of rainforests. There's a lot of water flow in Ecuador. A lot of that water flows down from the Andes west into the Pacific Ocean. And every once in a while, in these rivers, a big mat of vegetation, a big bank of the river will just fall off from erosion or whatever natural process. A tree will fall down, and on that little vegetation raft will be some sort of animal. It might be an iguana in the case of Galapagos Island. So this is just a normal sort of tree iguana that we'd find in the tropics, and this is the normal thing that we're used to seeing if we're going down to the rainforests. What happens is that this iguana, preferably a pair of them so they can mate and reproduce, get washed out towards the island. Just through random chance, that vegetation raft lands in the Galapagos Islands, and then through hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years of evolution, isolated away from the mainland, having to adapt to different conditions, a saltwater marine environment, rough lava, they gradually change form and turn into this really unique looking critter known as a Galapagos marine iguana, not found anywhere else on the earth besides Galapagos Islands. And they have ancestors, they have DNA shared with the mainland tree iguana that we see in Ecuador, Peru, and Costa Rica, and the West Indies, but they're quite different. And now this is not the webinar to go over all these things. I'm sure there are other expedition leaders that have done a fantastic job on that. I know Josie did one not too long ago. So there's a lot of interesting evolution going on here, but we're talking about photographing it today. But I couldn't talk about the photography without giving you some of the backstory and really why we ought to all appreciate the stuff that we have a chance to photograph in the Galapagos so much. So there's a really interesting story of these critters morphing from more common forms, isolated in the Galapagos Islands for many, many, many years. Everything's new, everything's wonderful. Let's talk about how to photograph it. Well, per the norm, I like to go into the gear. What sort of gear are we considering for Galapagos Islands? Well, like I said, Galapagos is probably the easiest, most fruitful way to get hordes of amazing wildlife photography. It is not a real challenging environment to photograph, unlike places like dense, dark rainforests. I talked about Borneo having certain challenges. If you saw Brad's webinar yesterday, night photography can be sometimes difficult. In the Galapagos Islands, we're on the equator, we're in full sun, we have amazing light, it's bright, we don't have to worry about these crazy high ISOs and really shallow depths of fields from big fancy lenses. You can get great photographs from almost anything out there, including a smartphone. You can get astonishingly close to animals within just a handful of yards or meters, depending on where you're from, but about 3 to 10 feet at times, amazing as they come up to you. So you can totally get away with a point and shoot camera. But as we all know, with photography, we tend to become perfectionists, or maybe we're perfectionists in the first place and we're drawn to photography. So, of course, having better and better cameras will get you better and better photographs, but it's not because of the technical limitations. You can get away with pretty much any camera and get some great shots. So I kind of just have this slide up here to say, the general range of cameras that I like to think about. But of course, being in photography for many years, I have a full frame camera. And if you do have a full frame camera, or crop frame or any sort of camera that you change lenses to, let me kind of go into some more detail there for Galapagos Islands. So here is my go-to kit. It works just fine. You don't need anything else in Galapagos if this is what you normally have. Some sort of camera body, some sort of normal wide angle telephoto, kind of medium, like lower telephoto wide angle landscape lens, like this 24 to 105. I call this your walking around lens, and then some sort of wildlife lens, like your 100 to 400 millimeter, a 70 to 300, just fine. However, with Galapagos, there's something interesting we can do with this kit, is we can replace that 100 to 400 with the venerable 70 to 200 class. Now, if this doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry about it. We'll move on from here in a second. But what this means for those that do have this lens or know about this class of lens is that you can get away with shooting at 200 millimeters in the Galapagos Islands at what is very often an f2.8 lens. So this makes for amazing portrait photography, wildlife portraits. You get that beautiful bokeh or bokeh in the background from that shallow depth of field. So the cool thing is technically you can leave your 100 to 400 at home in place of a 70 to 200. Now, if you want to get all the shots out there, even the stuff that might be a little bit more distant, not too many examples of that, but there could be some birds in the distance, could be some landscape shots in the distance. A bigger, beefier telephoto is great, but I'll tell you, if you have it at 70-200, do not leave for the Galapagos Islands without it, because it's going to be your workhorse. It's on your camera probably 70% of the time. So just to give you a little bit of a picture of the rest of the stuff I'm thinking about here, I love ultra wide angles. I use a 16 to 35 for my full frame camera. If you have a crop frame like a Canon Rebel or a Nikon 70-200, et cetera, that's gonna be like the 10 to 22 range. Great for big sweeping landscape shots. Lots of those in the Galapagos Islands. A macro is really quite fun in Galapagos. You think, well, don't we sort of get quite close to the animals? Yes, you can, but a macro exaggerates that in a really beautiful way. I do not bring a flash. You can't use flash. You don't need flash. You can shoot at very high depths of fields with a macro without flash. It's really quite fun. I do look at the lenses on this page as kind of like X factor lenses. I don't necessarily bring them all for every trip. It's kind of what jives with you. Are you more of a landscape person? You like the big, sweeping, almost fisheye style landscape shots? Do you like more of a travel style photography with that nifty 50 there at the top, the 51.4? Or are you thinking you might want to get the textures of all these reptiles and amazing animals where we see plant life as well with a macro? Smartphone, always a great idea. It's your second camera body. You can get great shots, great travel photography, great landscape shots. And then the other one that we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth when we talk about underwater photography is a GoPro. Any sort of action cam, any sort of sports cam that is capable of going underwater is really my go-to pick for underwater photography. We're going to get into more detail on that just in a little bit. Bring way more memory than you think. You can shoot easily 500 to 1,000 photos a day as an amateur intro photographer. You don't need to be a pro with the burst mode. I'm amazed how many photographs I have of the wildlife in Galapagos. Laptops, any sort of Galapagos expedition is going to be boat-based. Most of them, at least all that we do, are boat-based. I think it's the most comprehensive way to see the archipelago. And they have full power, normal US outlets, all that sort of stuff. So batteries, charger, laptop, all that great stuff. The main thing is consider memory. Bring a lot of it. Tripod, this is a big question. You really don't need a tripod in Galapagos. Again, you have a lot of light. You might be shooting at some dawn and dusk settings, People often ask, well, can you do star photography? Obviously, you're away from civilization. The challenge there is that for any sort of night photography, apart from the night that we spend in the tortoise camp, the rest of photography is really going to be on a boat at night. Even that slight movement, even if we're anchored, is going to be just enough to blur star photos. So it's a challenging area. In addition, next week I'll be talking about night photography and astrophotography, and I'll talk more about this then. But anytime you're in a humid marine environment, like next to the ocean, you get a little bit more layer of moisture in the atmosphere, and you're not going to see stars quite as much as you thought you might compared to like a desert environment. So tripod, I leave mine at home. If you're going to do videography, you might want to bring it. But again, lots of light in the Galapagos Islands. It's one of the greatest things about it. Okay, so that's all the gear. Let's talk about the techniques and tips. So right off the bat, we're going to talk about style of photography. And this goes for point and shoots, for iPhones, for big fancy cameras, you name it. It's all about perspective. In the Galapagos, a lot of the things are prostrate on land. They're low, they're down low. You don't have big towering trees there. So you can get amazing perspective if you're willing to move your body a little bit. I love cameras that have the swivel screen to them these days. You can actually pop it out and swivel it and put the camera down so you don't have to lay down on the ground to get shots like this. But this is a big thing is, resist the urge to stand at your normal 4 or 5, 6 feet tall and photograph down at the animals. You're going to get just not the ideal perspective. Go that extra mile, lean down, get on your knees. It's a sandy beach most of the time, and photograph plain with the terrain, because you're going to get a lot better shots of land iguanas crawling out of the brush and giant tortoises on plane. And even the bird life, because there are basically no natural predators, they're going to nest about 1 to 2 feet above the ground. All those red-footed boobies, blue-footed boobies, the petrels, the frigate birds, they're like right there at knee level as well. So adjust your perspective. Make sure you're getting down there and not photographing from the top above. Looking in those nooks and crannies and the crevices of the lava rock, you're going to get some great photos. Shots like this. So macro is a really fun thing to do in the Galapagos Islands. Now, you cannot, with every species in every scenario, get inches or feet away, but in some cases you can. And for those with point and shoots, the quickest way to get you macro capabilities is to find this little flower icon, hit it, and that reshuffles your camera settings to prioritize for making small things, or marine iguana is not that small, it's about 3 feet long, but smaller look even bigger than life in camera. So this one button, even if you're 6 feet away, you can still get a really big shot with this macro setting. However, with those that have more fancy cameras and more fancier capabilities to get shots like this with this extraordinary texture, what I love about the reptiles in Galapagos, I'm going to go over a few settings right here. So if you have a DSLR or a mirrorless or an advanced point and shoot where you can and you are comfortable dialing settings, this is what I recommend. You can shoot on full manual, or you can shoot some sort of derivation of aperture priority mode or P for program mode, but these are the settings that we're looking for. So for a shot like this where we're filling the frame with a big textured marine iguana with all these protrusions and all this lava rock, I love it. We want a very wide depth of field, way more than you'd think. We're really looking at like f11, f16. As a result, that is a pretty narrow pinhole aperture, so we do need to adjust our shutter. Even with all that light, we need to adjust our shutter. Fortunately, marine iguanas are very lazy and they're very sleepy, so shooting at 1/200th of a second can get you a great macro-like shot. It may not be a true macro, and we can talk about this later in the Q&A section, or you can watch one of my macro webinars, but nevertheless, the idea with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, or a 70 to 300 or 100 to 400 is you can zoom in, use these settings, and get a great textured shot like this. For something like this, I use ISO auto a lot these days. It will end up translating to around an ISO like 400-ish. You can adjust as needed, of course. Another big thing with Galapagos Islands is showing depth and showing the volume of creatures. This is a very common scene in Galapagos, seeing one of these massive piles of marine iguanas. We're on a little marine iguana kick here. Of course, a standard shot like this, definitely advisable. You want to get this shot. It's great. It's entertaining. It shows the story. You want to zoom in a little bit more and show just the piles and sometimes the colors. Different islands have different colorations of marine iguanas and even sizes. So definitely get this, but to get a real artistic shot, what we want to do is we want to show that depth through layering. So per my first advice, get down on their level. They might be on a ledge. As I recall, this shot was about 3 or 4 feet above ground, so I didn't have to contort my body too much, but I want to get on their level. I'm not shooting down at them. I'm not shooting up at them, but I'm shooting on their level. And then what I'm doing is I'm repositioning myself to make sure I have a nice background with some textures and some colors, but I'm not really worried about showcasing them with that high depth of field so that they're sharp. I'm actually doing the opposite. I'm going on a portrait mode here with point and shoot cameras. If you find this little portrait, it's usually this is a woman with a hat, but it's just some sort of side portrait-like icon. If you find that prioritizes your camera to have a shallow depth of field. What I'll do on my DSLR is I will either have a aperture priority or full manual mode, and I'll make sure that I'm on f4 or lower. That is really key to show this beautiful layering and really key to show this melting background in the distance. And really, even though we just saw these massive piles and hordes of marine iguanas, you say, well, aren't those the shots? Don't you want to show the 50 or 100 or 200 or 500 marine iguanas? Sometimes really to tell the story, what it's really about is just showcasing the idea of them piled on top of one another. So really look carefully in these massive aggregations of wildlife, and you don't necessarily need to show the whole picture, but just show an example of that. And I think this is a great one here. It's a close-up shot. I've got that macro texture, that good depth of field of the subject in focus, but they're kind of just lazily piled on top of one another, and you know that there's a group of them because of all of these other ones around, and that layering effect kind of melting off in the distance helps draw attention to the one I really want you to focus on. End of story, showing depth. Landscape photos. So although the wildlife to me really takes center stage, the landscapes I would say are equally beautiful. I love the landscapes of Galapagos Islands. The first thing is it's a really foreign landscape. It is like Mars, it is like the moon. It is hard for others to imagine what it really looks like and feels like to be there. So you really want to pay particular attention with your landscape photography. And this, you can take this lesson with any landscapes you have out there, but particularly true in Galapagos is showing the scale of landscapes. So this is one of those very large rocks I spoke of, the 40 large rocks in Galapagos. This is known as Kicker Rock. It's one that many itineraries will go through and go past and go around for photography. There's a lot of like bird rookeries around here, but showing some sort of scale, because without this little boat here, I don't even know if you noticed this, but without this boat here, it's hard to imagine, how big is this rock? Like, what is the size exactly? So having some sort of image or having some sort of subject other than your landscape to help show scale is really key. We can take this even further down the road and photograph it a little bit closer with this boat here. It doesn't have to be the most scenic shot. It's a little bit of a storytelling element, but getting vehicles and sometimes even getting people in your landscape shots. We saw this before when I was talking about that rough, ropey lava, but it's a very foreign idea to understand, well, how big is lava? What is a normal lava rope? The viewers of your photography may not even know what a lava rope is. You'll be an expert at it after you return from Galapagos and all the different types of lava, but having just a person in the background to show a little bit of scale of what you're walking on, what the size, the general context, it's a really important thing for these otherworldly, very foreign-like landscapes. Embrace the harshness. A lot of Galapagos is very harsh. It's very desolate. It may be a little bit abstract to compose or to use in composition for your photography. This photo, so of course the immediate advice here is embrace the harshness, showcase the harshness, but this one in particular I wanted to showcase because of the use of a telephoto lens in landscape photography, something that I'm very known to do. What you'll have here is a very varied scene. Right here, I'm using a telephoto to kind of tunnel vision myself into this lava crater and this very desert moon-like landscape. Over here on the right-hand side, there's a beautiful beach and turquoise waters and sort of some lush vegetation. You'll sort of see a snippet of that in a second. But what you can do with a telephoto is you can break your scene into very specific components, and I think it adds a lot to landscape photography, and especially when you want to showcase that very Martian-like landscape. Now, just a little bit to the right here, you can see a little bit of that vegetation that I was talking about, and there's a lot more to be had. So using that telephoto previously is a really important technique. Now, usually what you think about when depth of field comes into play for landscape photography is you want to have a wide depth of field. You want to have those big aperture numbers. You want to set your point and shoot camera on landscape mode to have everything in focus. And that's all well and good, but I will provide a little bit of advice here to recommend maybe thinking outside the box and having slightly shallower depth to show the depth of field or show the expanse of the landscape. What a shallower depth of field, like an f4 or an f5.6 does, is it kind of slightly blurs the background. You notice here, this is very crisp, sharp focus, but then in the background, it's a little bit hazy. It's a little bit more distant. Now, part of that haze is just the atmosphere, but what it does is it helps tell the story of the expanse of these islands and the expanse of this harsh landscape. So I will recommend sometimes dialing back on that depth of field, having a shallower depth of field than you think for some of those big landscape shots, and it really helps tell the story differently. Something you know that I'm a huge fan of is showcasing wildlife in landscapes. This could not be easier or could not be better than in the Galapagos Islands. There are beautiful landscapes everywhere you turn. Every time you turn left or right, there's a beautiful landscape to photograph. In addition, every time you turn left or right, there's some weird new animal in that landscape scene. You would almost, if you didn't want animals in that scene, you'd have to shoo them off. Don't do that. That's not allowed. But really, that's how abundant they are. So I really recommend with every landscape shot you have, ask yourself, can I put some sort of animal in that shot too? Because it becomes very, very easy. Even if it's not a big, massive target of the scene, even if it's not a huge component, but just these two sleeping Galapagos sea lions and this one little marine iguana here just kind of adds another dimension to the landscape shot. So be very mindful over trying to incorporate wildlife in your landscape shots. This is a lesson that I'll teach anywhere around the world, whether it's Antarctica or African safaris. It really, really ups your game for landscape photography if you can do that. A lot of places it's just not possible. So you just don't have that luxury everywhere you go. If you're in the meadows of high mountain Colorado, like I often photograph in the summer, you're not going to get lucky to have a bear walking across your landscape or have a mountain goat or something. But in places like Galapagos, it's very easy to do so. A very key point: incorporate wildlife in your landscape photography. Continuing on with landscape photography in the Galapagos, find patterns. I love filling the frame with specific patterns. Now here's a forest here in the highlands of Santa Cruz Island, an area that we always get to visit. It's where the giant tortoises are found, but the landscape's really beautiful. So finding those patterns, I think, can provide some of the most interesting landscape photography out there. It's not a big sweeping landscape. You don't need to have any sort of fancy lens for this. You don't need to have a fancy perspective, but being able to recognize those patterns, because they're usually in your own field of view. They're normally, only one little part of your field of view. It's not like we were walking through this forest and everywhere were these big moss-covered branches. It was simply not the case. But looking for a pattern, knowing that you have the right lens that can zero in your frame and create that image in your mind and then in the camera is a great thing for pattern photography. You can do so with the lava as well. I love the patterns of the ropey lava. You can use patterns in the soil and terrain. You can use patterns with the vegetation. There's a lot of beautiful, interesting sort of succulent vegetation in the Galapagos. And just filling the frame with it, using that telephoto for a landscape shot can provide really big dividends. And even the sand, if you can call this sand. I mean, imagine walking through a beach of sand where it's nothing but complete full seashells and urchin spines. I mean, that's really, really cool stuff. So just remembering when you're in the Galapagos and really anywhere in the world to start looking around, breaking your scene into individual parts and saying, how can I fill the frame with this and create a really unique pattern? Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about with landscape photography is a really unique opportunity here in the Galapagos Islands. And I'll be the first to admit, it's not something I spend a lot of time doing. It's not something I'm particularly versed at, but taking daytime long exposure photography can be a really, really fun thing. And Galapagos Islands provides one of the best times you may ever have in your travel career to be surrounded by swirling ocean water almost nonstop all day, every day. So as your small group of 8 or so people are walking along the shore and you're stopping to look at the scenery and learn a little bit about the wildlife you're witnessing right there, if you see a scene like this, I want to show you how you can get this interesting swirling long exposure motion of water during mid-time of the day or midday as you're walking around. So it's a pretty specific set of formula here, a number of steps. Basically, you need a few different things. The challenge with long exposure photography in the middle of the day is that usually your camera can't compensate with, like I say here, 1/10 of a second or 4 seconds it can't compensate with aperture to limit the amount of light in. So you can go test this out, even in your backyard, photograph at 1 second during the day, and the photo is probably going to turn out completely white or completely blown out, as we call it, and you won't get the photo you want. It's like you just painted with white and there's no texture, no color, and you can't really rescue that. However, there's just a small handful of filters that I do bring with me on most trips, and one of the most important is a neutral density filter. What this does is it actually tints your lens and limits the amount of light entering your camera. So what you can do is set your camera to a shutter speed priority, set it on auto ISO, program in about 1/10 of a second to 4 seconds, somewhere in the middle, try all different iterations, and then find some sort of area where the water's moving a lot, hit a focus point, and then take a few shots and experiment. What it'll do is, depending on where the water's flowing and how random it is or how much of a pattern, you'll get either a really chaotic scene like this, or you'll get a really nice, soft kind of water's edge scene as well. This is a really common technique. I see it on social media and on photo portfolios all the time, of like sunset or dusk times with ocean piers. And what you'll notice is the pier is in tack sharp focus. It's well lit, not like this. I have too many shadows in the shot to really make it a super great shot. But you'll notice the surface of the water is this nice kind of fuzzy haziness. And you'll wonder, how in the world did they get that? Well, it's that long exposure that allows the camera to capture all that movement of the water and turn it into the photo, and you get the scene like this. So anyway, I wanted to put this out there because it's a really interesting technique that you'll have a lot of opportunity to practice with in the Galapagos Islands. Okay, so sunsets and sunrises, arguably one of the best things to photograph in the Galapagos Islands. This is Court's patented 3-step sunrise sunset process. Patented, I've got it registered. No, of course it's not, but it's a really good technique, and you don't have to deviate much from it to get great sunsets, even if the sun setting, the overall sunrise sunset isn't that spectacular. It's just a small sliver of the sky. In fact, this was one of those scenes. So the first thing you want to do is you want to, of course, start with the rule of thirds. You can always break the rules later, but start with the rule of thirds and start with a telephoto lens. Again, I'm seeing a recurring theme during this presentation is that using a telephoto for landscape photography can be quite beautiful. That way you can kind of maximize the size of that boat or maximize the really colorful part of the sunset. So you start with telephoto and start with the rule of thirds. Okay, so you're breaking your scene down. You can kind of get 1/3 water, 2/3 horizon, or vice versa. The next thing you're going to want to do is, this is the challenging part, is you're going to want to split your exposure and your focus. Okay, so now if you're shooting on full auto, even with a point and shoot camera, you can still do this, except if you're shooting on full auto, you do have to change to P for program mode. If you're on a DSLR and shooting on any of the advanced modes like P, aperture priority, shutter speed priority, full manual, of course, is a little bit different, but with any of those aperture priority or shutter speed priority modes, you can do this, and here's how. So the reason we want to split focus and exposure is because usually when we depress the shutter button to take a shot, your camera is focusing and metering, meaning choosing the light and dark on whatever you focus on. But look at this scene here. See how this boat here is quite dark. If we were to meter and get an exposure on this boat, it would think, oh, the camera's thinking, okay, Court wants to take a photo of this boat. I'm going to lighten the whole scene so the boat is properly exposed. That's not the case with sunrise and sunset photography. It's the opposite. We do not want what we focus on necessarily to be perfectly exposed. What we do want perfectly exposed is the clouds, the color, and that texture. So what we do is we find this little asterisk on our camera. For the bigger, fancier cameras, it's usually a button on the outside of the camera. On my Canon 5D, it's this little button right here. Sometimes it's a button that says AEL, or auto exposure lock. So what we do is we take our little focus point that's usually in the middle of the camera, we aim it at a really colorful textured part of the clouds that we like what you like most, what you think is the richest color, and you hit that asterisk. It will actually save in the camera's menu, or sorry, save in the camera's memory for about 10 to 15 seconds, that exposure meter. And then you have that time to then find the thing you want to focus on, which in this case is a foreground element of that boat. Hold the shutter halfway, that locks focus. One more step. Recompose to the rule of thirds, because we're moving our camera all around here, right? You're tagging the exposure, you're tagging the focus. Recompose the rule of thirds and take the shot. And you're going to get this almost each and every time, some amazing, amazing photographs of sunrises and sunsets. You can save yourself a step if you don't have that foreground element. So I love including something in the foreground, like a boat, a person, a vehicle, a rock, a tree. I think having something in the foreground that is silhouetted like that can be really, really meaningful. It provides a little bit more context and something just interesting to look at for the viewer. However, I would say maybe 9 times out of 10, you don't have that when you're on big ocean views like this, like we're probably gonna be in the Galapagos Islands most often. What you can do is save yourself a step. You don't have to find that asterisk button. You do not have to auto exposure lock. You just point your focus at that textured cloud, the colorful part right here that I'm circling, lock the focus, it locks the exposure in the same area, and boom, done. Because you don't need to separate that focus. You can focus on the distant clouds, and that's just fine. There's not anything real prominent here that if we don't focus perfectly, the photo's gonna be botched. It just doesn't exist. So anyway, hopefully it wasn't too complicated. I did go a little bit down the rabbit hole there. I can of course answer questions at the end on my patented process, but I'll tell you, start with a telephoto, find some really cool clouds, a part of the sky, even if it's a snippet, aim for those clouds, the color and texture, and get some great shots each and every time. You can break the rules, okay? So you don't always have to adhere to the rule of thirds. If you find there's some nice color, some patterns, or something going on, you wanna bisect that shot right down the middle, go for it. Rules are meant to be broken, but always start with the rule of thirds. Okay, we're moving back to wildlife here, photographing giant tortoises. I want to tell you, this is one of the icons of Galapagos Islands. You can't leave there without a couple of good shots of giant tortoises. That all being said, there are only a couple spots in the Galapagos Islands where giant tortoises are routinely found and accessible for photography. So on those days that you're there, you definitely want to make the most out of it. You definitely want to photograph the absolute heck out of them. So I'm going to show you the different ways to do so. So first and foremost, you want to incorporate scale. So like I was talking with landscape photos, a big tortoise like this, they're massive. I mean, you can see how huge they are. Getting a person in your shot, getting something familiar in your shot is really, really paramount. In addition, you don't want to just necessarily take the full landscape shots. Look at the different elements of the tortoise. I think the tortoise's face is one of the most interesting things. I mean, look at how primordial, look at how interesting this is with all these textures, and it's almost like, bone kind of chipping off of its nose. This is a completely natural, healthy tortoise, but look how crazy this is. So filling the frame and getting that big depth of field and breaking the scene into parts. You don't necessarily need to get the whole tortoise to make it a big image to showcase a big animal. You can photograph its head and its neck. You can even, not get its eyes in the scene, not get its head. Photograph its toenails and its feet and that rough, rigid texture. Fill the frame with nothing but the carapace or the skin, et cetera, et cetera. Taking a very different approach with parts of the animal is really, really key to photographing big animals. You probably heard me say this with tigers and lions and all, bears and all sorts of other stuff. You can photograph parts and get great photos because nowadays, when we're showcasing our photos, we're really showcasing like a set of photos online, on social media, a slideshow with friends. So you don't have to get just that one perfect shot that features every single part of the animal. You can showcase 4 or 5 shots in a row, and it does a really, really great job. So just like we like layering with landscape photography, and I love layering with wildlife. You saw me exemplify this with the marine iguanas. It's still very, very possible the giant tortoises. Look around, move your body. You can walk around freely in these areas, and you can find exactly where you line up to get that, for instance, this line of heads. But make sure you know exactly where you want to focus and how you want to have that layering effect so the rest of the tortoises appear in the shot, but don't necessarily distract you. Because if all these tortoise heads were in perfect focus, you wouldn't really know what the subject of the photo is. What I'm trying to do here is showcase one, that really cool expression kind of popping up, nice sunlit right here, then show it is part of this massive aggregation of tortoises in the highlands of Santa Cruz. There is a very good chance you're going to photograph baby tortoises if you visit the Charles Darwin Research Station. My advice here is kind of simple. It's not the only way to photograph baby tortoises, but I do recommend doing the opposite of what you'd think when photographing tortoises or really any animal in some sort of conservatory or in sort of captivity. I actually like to include something in the photograph like a water pail, like a sign, like a food dish. These are hatchlings that are going to be replaced into the wild, but in the meantime, they're for the first 5 years of life, since these things live to a couple hundred years old, they are infants, so they have to be watched closely. But if you were just to take a photo of nothing but the tortoise, it's weird to say, but they're such perfect replicas of their bigger adult counterparts that's really hard to understand scale. So having some sort of water thing or like a food dish really helps with the captive photography of these little baby tortoises. Just pro tip from there. Okay, a huge question here, underwater photography. Should I do it? How do I do it? What's the best way? So I've got some good and bad news here. You can get some great underwater photographs. Underwater experiences in the Galapagos is arguably half the experience, and it is sublime. Daily snorkeling, it's amazing. What you'll see with your eyes are scenes like this, and you're gonna remember it as the most vibrant, amazing thing, and it's a huge part of the trip. What the camera usually captures, even if there's wildlife all around you, is something like this. It is really disappointing to try to do underwater photography unless you have really primo gear. And I mean not just an underwater housing for your good camera, but lights and strobes and dome ports and the right kind of lens that may not be useful for anything else on the trip except for underwater photography. We're talking about thousands, if not over $10,000 worth of equipment. What I recommend is, first, this is a time of these expeditions that I love just putting the camera down and just not worrying about it and just enjoying my float. I know that it's so hard to capture what I'm seeing that's really what I do is I just enjoy it. However, it is really fun to capture something of your experiences. These are not gonna be the covers of National Geographic. I totally get that. But having a GoPro, some sort of action cam that's very easy, no fuss, makes it really easy to capture what you're seeing. It's still not, necessarily the right color. It's still a little bit distorted, but I think GoPros, for a couple $100 are definitely the best way to get something of your underwater experience. But just dial back those expectations a little bit. Now, that all being said, there is one piece of gear that if I was heading to the Galapagos tomorrow, I would look into and think about. And I don't know anything about this brand, but it seems pretty good from my research online. Essentially, it is an underwater housing for your smartphone. So it turns, the great camera tech that we have in these smartphones nowadays, and it allows you to photograph underwater. For less than a GoPro, you get this case. And most importantly, you're probably wondering, what in the world is this big eye doing right here? Well, what this sort of dome port is enabling you to do is get the classic travel shot where you get the underwater world in focus and the above water world in focus. The reason this works is that dome extends out to the minimum focusing distance, more or less, of your camera, of your smartphone. And so it allows you to get that focus where otherwise most of this water's edge would just be completely blown out. It'd be completely unfocused and it'd take too much of the scene. So that's something that I would do. Just quick pro tip, I would consider looking into one of those if you are really into underwater photography, and I'd be going for this shot right here. I wouldn't be trying to get macro shots of all the different nudibranchs and trying to get, full frame shots of sea turtles. I would be going just to document my experiences, and shots like this are really fun. Okay, another thing to consider, photographing out of a moving zodiac. Pangas are what they're called in Galapagos Islands. A couple of considerations. The first thing is camera protection. I always recommend folks buy or at least borrow or bring one of these dry bags. I have my trusty one here. The 8-liter size is my recommendation. We actually sell these in our gear store at Natural Habitat Adventures. You can easily go online if you have an REI near you. Pretty much any outdoor retailer sells these things, and they're pretty inexpensive. They're like $15 or $20. And what I'll do, it's very simple. I'm not gonna stuff my camera in here and close it 3 times over to make it completely watertight. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna have my camera around my neck like I would, camera ready for the photograph, but I'm gonna slip this around my camera, and I'm actually gonna use these clips, not to perfectly seal it, to make it watertight, you do have to fold it over 3 times, but I'm just gonna wrap it around and clip it, so that way any sort of salt spray, anything that's coming from the environment and might splash on me, it's not gonna splash right on my lens to fog my camera or make me have to clean my lens, or it's not gonna get in the body of my camera and have any sort of issues with salt water. So it's actually pretty straightforward, pretty easy. Just wrap around, clip it, and that's great protection. It's pretty darn good. It works very well. The other thing to consider is how you're gonna photograph if you yourself are moving. Now, what I'll often be talking about with fast motion photography is usually, predators on the plains of Africa running at 60 miles an hour like cheetah, and how do you stop that motion? Well, in this case, it's you that are moving. If you're bobbing up and down a little bit in the panga and you need to hold still enough to get a nice crisp shot of one of the sedentary birds on the cliffside. Basically, you're gonna prioritize a fast shutter speed. If you have a point and shoot camera, find this little running man somewhere on your camera. It's usually in your scene settings or in your menu settings. if you have the ability to go to a shutter speed priority mode, usually signified by an S or a TV, usually you want to shoot at least 1/500th of a second. 1/1000 is ideal. And then start to get comfy with some of the higher ISOs. Even though this is full daylight photography, you do not need to worry about that low light stuff that would normally be associated with high ISOs. But something like an 800 will allow you to take that 1/1000 shutter speed and freeze the motion as you yourself are moving with your hands. You know, image stabilization is going to work a little bit, but if you're moving in some choppy water, to freeze motion like this, you've got to have these fast shutter speeds. So harsh sunlight can be a consideration in Galapagos too. It's right on the equator. It's usually very, very sunny. So oftentimes you're getting very big, straight sunlight, daylight, like harsh lighting conditions. How to deal with it? What's the strategy? Well, simply put, use it to your advantage. So how do you do so? Well, one way is if you have a ton of light, you can take really, really fast shutter speeds, like I was talking about before. So you can be at like 1/2000. You can be 1/5000 in some cases because your camera can deal with that because of all the light. So what it allows you to do with all this moving water and lapping water is really focus and concentrate on some of the sea foam and how it's moving. You can get some really interesting shots if you can really stop down and take a really, really fast shutter speed. The other thing is embrace the contrast. You're going to get really bright whites and really dark darks. Think about taking your photos, maybe not in black and white, but transitioning the black and white on your computer afterwards. That sort of high contrast, high tonality type of shot is really, really good for maximizing potential at that harsh midday light. You're going to get harsh shadows, you're going to get bright highlights, but black and white photography yields itself really, really well to it. In addition, with all the black lava and all the dark creatures in the Galapagos Islands, it makes it really captivating scenes. So to deal with harsh sunlight, use it to your advantage. The other thing you can do if you don't need or don't benefit from a really fast shutter speed is you can use a very, very wide depth of field. So you can shoot at f11, at f16, at f22 and get every little bit of this crab in perfect focus. Maybe not that back leg, because I think it was moving right there, but you can use very, very high depths of field to get these macro shots I talked about earlier in this webinar. The other thing you can do is you can break your scene down into smaller components. So here we have a scene, a classic scene in Galapagos Islands. We got a little lava lizard sitting on top of a marine iguana. And it's very, harshly lit in the background over here, a lot of shadows right here, some sort of darkness, some brightness, some darkness. It's very, very modeled. What you can do is use that zoom telephoto, break your scene down, envision where can you find the somewhat even lighting. So breaking down with that zoom telephoto and just taking part of the scene, again, resisting the temptation to take the whole scene, no matter how interesting it is, and break it down into somewhat of an even lighting for just that portion of what you're looking at through your camera. People often ask, do I need a polarizer or do I want a polarizer for Galapagos Islands? I don't bring a polarizer with me very often on trips around the world, but for Galapagos, it certainly is. This is a good scene, good example. You get that nice bright blue sky. Notice how there's a nice margin to the clouds that the polarizer brings out. It also helps saturate the greens and blues from the water. So one of the main benefits of a polarizer is that it helps saturate skies, helps make the clouds pop, and it saturates those blues and greens. The other thing that it does is it helps you see through water with reflections. That's the main reason for a polarizer, why they exist in our sunglasses. So we have a little Port Jackson shark here in one of the tide pools. You couldn't really see it without a polarizer because it's just under the water, but that polarizer takes out the glare to get a cool shot of an underwater creature while you're walking on land. And the same thing exists as we're cruising around on the boat looking for marine life when we're going from island to island or motoring from different places between our hikes on islands. You'll often see manta rays and sea turtles popping up, and it just helps make a little bit more definition in the surface of the water by using a polarizer. So I quite like it. So as we near the end here, I'll definitely recommend, if you do have questions, be sure to get those in. Photographing in sand. This is something I haven't talked about in previous Galapagos photography webinars, but it's a lot like photographing in snow. Not because of the danger to the camera, although that's there, don't drop your camera, but it's mostly because of how a camera meters. And if you have a preponderance of white and bright in your scene, you are going to need to adjust for that because the camera thinks that it wants to dim it down. Remember, for proper exposure, your camera is thinking it wants about 18% gray. The way to overcome this, the way to get great scenes like this and make sure that the sand comes out the proper color that it actually is, that your eyes are actually seeing it, is remember, just find this exposure meter, It's usually denoted by a little plus or minus, and go to the right. You're actually going to overexpose your shot. Otherwise, you'll see when you have the majority of your scene as bright white sand, your camera is going to darken the whole scene, and you risk losing a lot of color and texture and light in the shadows of the critters you're trying to photograph. So with that being said, Galapagos Islands, gosh, I love it. Just looking back through these photos, you know, what a tantalizing place. There's so much to love, so much to photograph. I hope these tips have certainly been helpful. I have more tips on the naturalphotographer.org. This is a great evergreen site that we talk about all sorts of things, nature and wildlife photography. I've gotten some questions recently about how to follow me on some of my adventures. The best way, as cheesy as it sounds, is via Instagram. If you want to check me out, Court_Whelan. In addition, check out Natural Habitat Adventures as well. It's a great way to see what we're up to. And in addition, you know, other than just, you know, following along and seeing what we're doing, I will say Instagram is a phenomenal way to learn photography. And the reason I say that is it's a great way to see other people's styles, to look at the possibilities out there, to try to emulate after people from the inspiration you're seeing. It's probably the easiest, most fun, passive way while you're sitting around waiting for your next trip to see what photographs are possible out there in the locations you love or maybe are headed to next. In addition, last quick plug, we have a new program here at Natural Habitat Adventures. I've mentioned a few times, Photo Pro Expeditions. If you head to this website on top, it'll get you to our 2 different types of photo tours and Photo Pro Expeditions. This is the direct link to Photo Pro Expeditions here. I'll let this website fill you in more. And then last but not least, as a little bit of a surprise, I've gotten a request recently to show a little bit more about one of the presenters. And this is not me, but our hostess with the mostest. Someone would ask, well, gosh, who is Kendall? What exactly is going on here? So I wanted to showcase a little bit of Kendall. Kendall, please don't kill me. She is literally the person behind the famous woman behind Sea Lion in Galapagos. This is Kendall, folks. I want to truly, sincerely give a huge round of applause because she is the brain behind all these operations. She makes it happen. She schedules it. She's a fantastic host and moderator at all these. So Kendall, thank you for all that you've done over the last year and many years beyond that. But yeah, we actually did have a special request to see who is the mysterious woman behind the scenes. That's Kendall. And this is a fledgling little bird in Galapagos Island. So thanks, and I'll take some questions.
Thanks a lot, Court.
Put you on the spot there.
Well, we do have some good questions for you. I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question for Court, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. All right, we have a good variety of questions for you, and I'm going to start off with one that is not photography related. Someone is watching and who's grateful that our trips are carbon neutral, but they just want to know, what do we do to prevent any destruction of habitat or wildlife in the areas we visit? And do we have any programs that will help the human populations on the islands?
Yes, I'm so proud and so happy to have an unequivocal, resounding yes to all that. We do a lot of precautions. We go above and beyond and do a lot of work directly with the communities, local schools, donation to various centers, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm happy to say it's not the protection. So the protections that the tourism and travel industry have towards the islands are beyond just individual efforts like natural habitats and lindblads and those out there. The way tourism was done initially in Galapagos Islands is that it was set up in a very, very responsible way. And the tour operators have to abide by very, very strict regulations. One of the biggest things, if you want to Google it, Google the Galapagos Islands Special Law. I believe it was set aside or set up in 1998, and there's been a couple subsequent after that. And there are a lot of regulations on exactly where you can walk, how long you can spend on land. Frankly, one of the big differentiators for natural habitat is the type of permits we have to land on the islands. You know, even if you had your own boat and you're leaving Guayaquil, Ecuador, and you're zooming over to the Galapagos, you could not step foot on any of the islands without proper, real deal, like grandfathered in authorization. There is a huge amount of steps to be able to get into these natural areas of Galapagos. I would say it's one of the most intensely and well-protected places on the planet. Now, I'm not going to say it's completely perfect. There is human habitation. Invasive species have come to the islands, you know, just as much back from the pirate days as they have in modern times. but there is a lot of regulation. There's even more regulation about boats and how they deal with emissions, how they deal with any sort of outflow, how they deal any sort of fishing boats down there, what they can and cannot do. There's a ton of regulation, way more than I can talk about here, but I can say happily, as an ecotourism student, I studied the Galapagos a lot, and it is one of the most inspiring, fascinating stories out there. We, of course, at NatHab try to go above and beyond, but the great thing is that anybody that does anything in the Galapagos Islands have to adhere to these regulations, and it's pretty intense in a very good protective way. In addition, there is a national park fee that you have to pay to get to the islands. I don't know what it currently is. I think it's like $120 per person, but about I think 40% of that goes directly to the local schools and local communities that may have nothing to do with tourism. So it's a great model. It's another classic example of how conservation travel and ecotourism is done right, how that revenue can, even if you're not in the tourism industry, still benefit the land in the area. So there's a lot of positivity to share around that, but I'll stop there. But yeah, I'd be happy to, you can tell I'd be happy to talk more on that anytime.
Absolutely. Thanks, Court. Are there any weight limitations for airplanes that would limit the amount of gear one could bring?
Yeah, there are, but they're like the same limitations as any domestic flight in the US. I think it's 50 pounds, 1 or 2 suitcases, and the carry-ons, they're like 737s, so they're normal carry-on size, not even like a regional jet. So there are limitations, but nothing that you'd be surprised of.
All right, let's get into some photography questions since we're running short on time here. Do you need a tripod for long exposures and when you're using your neutral density filter?
Good check. Yeah, so as much as I said you don't need a tripod, or maybe you don't need a tripod earlier on, yes, if you do wish to do those long exposure photographs, you would need a tripod. You can get away with bracing it like on a rock, or if you're at 1/10 or 1/20th of a second, you might be able to hold really still. But if you do want to mess around with that technique, which I think is a lot of fun, yeah, you would benefit a lot from having a tripod, certainly. So yeah, good catch on that.
Okay. And you talked about using the dry bag to cover your camera when you're in the Zodiac. One, can you please reiterate the size of the dry bag that you recommend? And also, how do you handle the salt spray on the lens and camera when you're actually photographing?
Yeah, great question. So this is 8 liter. So the 8 liter, they're in liter units. And I think it's the perfect size for a DSLR, even a bigger lens. They have bigger and smaller ones. So if you have a smaller camera, like a point and shoot, and just don't think you need that much of a size, they have like 4 liters and 2 liters. The best thing to do would probably be to bring your camera into an outdoor store if you have one in your area, and just have an associate help you. Take them out of the bag, put them on, check it out. But they're really useful for like anything. I mean, I use this thing so often. Then the other question is how to protect your lens from salt spray. Yeah, so I don't want to paint too grim of a picture. You're not going to get a lot of salt spray. I mean, you might go an entire Zodiac ride and not get a drop on you. It's not like you're in real rough waters. It's more of just like the what if. So what if you do have a little bit of spray and you're photographing? The best thing I do is I make sure I always have a lens hood on my lens. That's like the big extension that it's just a piece of plastic basically. They're mostly designed to prevent lens flare if you're shooting towards the sun or even slightly towards the sun, but I think they really double, and to me, they're more valuable in preventing any sort of water, or even like if you're putting it on your lap for a second and smudge the lens, if you have that big protrusion of like 2 to 4 inches, the chance of anything getting in there is so much less. So I have almost a perfect track record as long as I use that lens hood.
So I have a pretty specific question here for you next. It says, how do you focus on clouds in a sunset? My mirrorless keeps telling me I can't focus when I press halfway. It's on autofocus.
Yeah, so what you need to look for, so most autofocusing systems, which I use 99% of the time, I rarely do manual focus, is you want to look for some sort of contrast. So focusing relies on contrast, like the light and dark, or the bright and dim, or even contrast in different colors. So what I'll usually do is if I have trouble finding focus on a cloud, it's usually because I'm aiming right at the bright white spot. If I can aim right at the margin between the cloud and the sky, or between the cloud and like a bright streak. Maybe the clouds are sort of like a dim red, but there's like this bright orange line. I'll look and aim for that orange line, and that should get focus each and every time. Usually if it does not focus, it's because you're trying to focus your focusing box on something that's a little bit too uniform in light. Look for that contrast.
Okay. And someone is wondering about when they're slowing down their speed, they get too much light and it whites out the photo. So if the speed is 1/10 of a second, 1/10 of a second, what other settings do I need to use?
Yeah, so this is where I'm talking about that neutral density filter. That filter is designed specifically for that problem. What happens is that your camera will already be at the lowest ISO number. It'll already be at the highest f-stop, and that's all your camera can do to prevent light from entering the sensor. And so 1/10 of a second might be blown out, so you know 1 full second is going to be 10 times more blown out. So the issue, or maybe not quite 10 times, 6 times, I guess. But well, no, I guess it is 10 times. Yeah, math is just not coming to me today. But basically, yeah, so you want to get that neutral density filter. It's going to limit light in a very manual way, and then your camera will be able to compensate from traditional things like aperture and ISO. But basically, you want your aperture on the biggest F number, and you want your ISO on the lowest number. Sometimes it'll go down to 100 or even 50, or sometimes it's ISO L. ISO L stands for low, and that's just all you can do to limit light. Other than that, if that's still not working, you ought to pick up a neutral density filter. But that's why they're made. So it's a very common problem that you have, but neutral densities will fix it.
And related to that, which level of neutral density filter do you suggest?
Great question. I think I have a 6-stop, and it's kind of middle of the road. I do not have one of these new variable neutral density filters, but what they are is they're basically 2 polarizers stacked on top of each other. So you can actually twist the neutral density filter and it'll go lighter and darker, which means you have like a variable stop ND. So for those that aren't familiar, the reason they have these stops, these classes like a 6-stop or a 10-stop neutral density filter, is that's how many stops of darkness it's basically giving you. So if you're like a studio photographer and you know exactly how much you want to darken it, you can probably do the calculations. Remember, 1 stop is basically giving the ability to photograph it at twice or half the shutter speed. Remember, that's how we talk about stops, is twice or half the shutter speed, or up 1, down 1 in the aperture rating, like from 5.6 to 8 or 5.6 to 4. That's 1 stop. So 6 stops is a lot. But I find that, even though I could probably be a little bit more precise with like a 2 or a 4-stop, it's just not, there's not enough tinting to really be a game changer for those bright conditions. So that was kind of a long way of saying, I think 6-stop is a nice middle of the road, but I would potentially consider one of those variable ND filters, because they're newer. Like I bought my ND filter years and years ago when those variable ones weren't out yet.
Okay, great. Well, it's past the top of the hour, so I'm going to call it there with questions. Thank you so much, Court. Wonderful tips as always, and you have me dreaming of being back on that beach in the Galapagos. So I appreciate your time today. I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Yeah, I hope that's what I did, is accomplish a little bit of travel intrigue, whether you're headed to the Galapagos Islands or just thought, oh, I've always thought about that. I can tell you it is one of the most mesmerizing, amazing places in the world. Whether you are an intro photographer, not a photographer, or a pro photographer, it's definitely got something for everyone. You do not have to be a photographer to enjoy the islands. But if you are, like I said, it's one of the best places on planet Earth to photograph. So definitely have it on your list. Definitely get there sooner than later. It's a great place, and I know you're going to enjoy it. So cheers, folks. Enjoy.
Thanks again, Court. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.